March 28, 1942. The waters of the Loire estuary churn beneath the hull of a weathered destroyer. To the German sentries patrolling the fortified port of Saint-Nazaire, France, the vessel appears to be one of their own, the Mo-class destroyer they recognize as belonging to the Kriegsmarine. But this is no German ship. This is HMS Campbelltown, a relic of the U.S. Navy handed over to the British, now transformed into the most unlikely weapon of war ever conceived. Packed within its steel bowels, hidden behind false bulkheads and beneath tons of concrete ballast, lies 4.5 tons of high explosives, a bomb with a ship wrapped around it. The men aboard are not ordinary sailors. They are commandos, members of the British Special Forces, volunteers for what they know is likely a one-way mission. Their objective, the destruction of the Normandy dock, the only dry dock on the Atlantic coast large enough to accommodate Hitler's pride, the battleship Tirpitz. The clock is ticking, both literally and figuratively, as the ship approaches its final destination under the cloak of darkness. The night air is thick with tension as HMS Campbelltown, disguised as a German destroyer, makes its way up the Loire River. The 611 men aboard, 346 Royal Navy sailors and 265 commandos, maintain an eerie silence. Each man knows the odds. Survival is not guaranteed, not even expected. The German defenses at Saint-Nazaire are formidable. Searchlights sweep the waters, machine gun nests dot the shoreline, and artillery pieces stand ready to unleash their deadly fire. Yet the British plan relies on audacity and deception, not brute force. The Campbelltown's German flag flies proudly. Its crew stands at attention in uniforms mimicking those of the Kriegsmarine. The ship's silhouette, altered to resemble a German Mo-class destroyer, is their only shield in the darkness. The men can smell the salt spray, feel the vibration of the engines through the soles of their boots, and hear the gentle lapping of water against the hull, sensation that will soon be replaced by the cacophony of battle. In the captain's cabin of the Campbelltown, Commander Robert Ryder studies the maps one last time. The plan is deceptively simple. Ram the destroyer into the caisson gate of the Normandy dock at maximum speed, disembark the commandos who will destroy as much of the dock's infrastructure as possible, and then withdraw aboard the small motor launches that have accompanied them on this perilous journey. The explosives hidden in the ship's bow are set on a time delay, giving the men approximately 8 hours to complete their mission and escape before the ship and the dock are obliterated. Ryder knows that even if everything goes perfectly, many of his men will not return. The weight of this knowledge is visible in his eyes, but his voice remains steady as he gives final instructions to his officers. In the cramped quarters below, commandos check their weapons one last time. Sten guns, grenades, explosives, each movement economical, precise, betraying no fear. These are men who have volunteered for the impossible, knowing that success might only be recognized in history books written after their deaths. The German sentries at Saint-Nazaire have grown complacent. The Normandy dock, one of the largest in the world, represents the pinnacle of French engineering, seized by Germany after the fall of France in 1940. It is their gateway to Atlantic dominance, the facility that allows their largest warships to be repaired and refitted without returning to Germany. The defenses are formidable concrete walls 10 feet thick, anti-aircraft batteries, searchlights, machine gun nests, and thousands of soldiers. Yet the Germans cannot imagine that anyone would be foolish or desperate enough to attempt a direct assault on this fortress. They prepare for air raids, for naval bombardments from a distance, but not for a suicide mission in the form of a destroyer packed with explosives. This blind spot, this failure of imagination, is precisely what the British are counting on. As the Campbelltown draws closer to its target, the German lookouts peer through binoculars, seeing only what they expect to see: one of their own ships, probably damaged, seeking refuge in their heavily fortified harbor. The ticking clock in the Campbelltown's bow continues its relentless countdown, unheard by anyone but the British officers who know its deadly secret. The Loire estuary is a maze of shoals and sandbanks, navigable only by those who know its treacherous waters. The British have chosen this route precisely because the Germans consider it too dangerous for large ships. Under the cover of darkness, with only the faint glow of the moon reflecting off the water, the Campbelltown makes its way through this natural barrier, accompanied by 16 smaller motor launches. The men on board can see the lights of Saint-Nazaire growing brighter in the distance, a beacon drawing them toward their destiny. The air is cold, and many men pull their collars tighter against the chill, though the cold they feel is as much from fear as from the night air. Some whisper prayers, others check their equipment again and again, while a few stare into the darkness, their minds far away, perhaps thinking of homes they may never see again. The ship's engines, normally a comforting presence, now seem to beat like a nervous heart, each vibration bringing them closer to the moment when deception will no longer be possible. The ticking ticking clock hidden in the ship's bow continues its relentless countdown, measuring not just time but the lives of the men aboard. The first critical test of the audacious plan came not from German guns, but from the treacherous waters of the Loire estuary itself. At 1912 hours, as the flotilla of 1 destroyer and 16 motor launches navigated the shallow, shifting channels, a signal flare hissed into the night sky from the French shore. It was not German, it was French, a signal from the resistance, a warning that their approach had been detected. The tension aboard HMS Campbelltown, already stretched taut, snapped into a state of hyper-alertness. Commander Ryder on the bridge felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The element of surprise, their only real advantage, was fraying. He ordered the ship's speed increased, pushing the old 4-stacker destroyer to its limits, its engines groaning in protest. The disguise, the flag, the altered silhouette, all of it was now a fragile shield. On the decks below, the commandos felt the change in the ship's vibration. A deeper, more urgent thrumming that signaled the point of no return had been crossed. The mission was no longer a possibility. It was a reality, and it was hurtling toward its violence. The grinding impact of the Campbelltown's bow into the Normandy dock's caisson was the signal for a pandemonium of controlled violence. The ship, now a grotesque steel sculpture jammed into the enemy's most vital asset, became the epicenter of a battle that raged on 3 levels: on the blood-soaked decks of the destroyer itself, on the concrete piers and quays of the dock, and within the labyrinthine tunnels and machine houses of the facility. The primary phase of the mission, the delivery of the weapon, was complete. The secondary phase, the commando assault to ensure the dock's total and permanent destruction, was just beginning, and it was a descent into a special kind of hell. On the forecastle of the Campbelltown, the scene was one of utter devastation. The force of the collision had buckled the forward section of the ship, killing or incapacitating many of the naval personnel stationed there. The massive charge of amytal, hidden deep within the hull, had survived the impact, a testament to the ingenuity of its placement. Now, the priority was to get the commandos off the ship and onto the dock. The gangways and scrambling nets that had been prepared for this moment were, in many cases, destroyed or hanging at impossible angles. The German machine gunners, recovering from their initial shock, had found their range. Tracers, like malevolent fireflies, swept across the open decks, cutting down any man who dared to stand. The air was a thick, choking soup of smoke from burning oil and cordite, mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of blood. The screams of the wounded were a constant, piercing counterpoint to the roar of the guns. For the commandos waiting in the relative shelter of the mess decks, the path to freedom and to their objective was a gauntlet of fire. Lieutenant Colonel Newman, the embodiment of calm command, was one of the first to leap from the ship onto the dock. He landed heavily, his Sten gun at the ready, and immediately began organizing the men as they followed him. His presence was a focal point, a beacon of order in the chaos. He had to get his teams to their assigned targets: the pumping station, the winding houses, the bridge that connected the old port to the new dock, and the U-boat pens. Each target was a vital component of the dock's functionality, and their destruction was essential to ensure the Normandy dock would be out of commission not just for months, but for years. The commandos, once they hit the concrete, fanned out in pre-arranged groups, their training taking over. They moved with purpose, using the cover of cranes, sheds, and the massive dockside machinery to advance. Their faces, blackened with camouflage cream, were masks of grim determination. They were no longer sailors. They were infantrymen in a hostile city, and their city was a fortress of steel and concrete. The German response was swift and brutal. The garrison, though initially surprised by the sheer audacity of the attack, was composed of professional soldiers. They recovered quickly, bringing disciplined rifle and machine gun fire to bear on the British forces. Searchlights continued to rake the dock area, silhouetting the commandos and making them easy targets. The Germans also had a significant advantage in heavy weapons. Armored cars, their headlights blazing, appeared on the quays, their 20 autocannons spewing a deadly hail of explosive shells. The sound was different from the rifles, a deeper, more percussive thump-thump-thump that echoed off the concrete walls, each round capable of tearing a man in half. The commandos, armed mainly with rifles, Sten guns, and grenades, were outgunned. Their only advantages were their superior training, their initiative, and their desperation. They fought back with a ferocity that shocked the Germans, engaging the armored cars with grenades and gammon bombs, small, powerful explosive devices designed for anti-tank work. One of the most critical targets was the pumping and winding house that controlled the caisson gate and the water level in the dock. Destroying this would ensure that even if the caisson was repaired, the dock could not be operated. The team assigned to this task, led by a red-headed captain named Roy Hodges, fought their way through a maze of walkways and stairwells. They were met with fierce resistance from German sailors and technicians who had been roused from their bunks and were defending their posts with desperate courage. courage. The fighting was close quarters, brutal and personal. It was fought with rifles, bayonets, and even fists in the narrow corridors. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and sweat. Hodges' men, though outnumbered, fought with a cold, professional efficiency, clearing the building room by room. Once they had secured the area, the explosive experts moved in, placing their charges with meticulous care on the massive pumps, the winding gear, and the control panels. The low, steady tick-tick-tick of the timers being set on these smaller charges was a chilling echo of the larger, more devastating clock hidden in the Campbelltown's hull. While Hodges' team was securing the pumping house, another group was fighting its way toward the bridge that connected the old town of St. Nazaire to the dock area. This bridge was a vital choke point. Destroying it would prevent German reinforcements from easily crossing into the dock and would also hinder any British withdrawal. The assault on the bridge was a bloody stalemate. The Germans had fortified both ends with machine guns, and the open approach offered no cover. The commandos tried to flank the position, using the darkness and the confusion of the battle to their advantage, but they were cut down one by one. The leader of this team, a young lieutenant, was killed in the first rush, and his men, leaderless and pinned down, were forced to take cover in a nearby warehouse, where they fought a desperate last stand against an ever-increasing number of German troops. Their sacrifice, though it failed to destroy the bridge, tied down significant German forces that might otherwise have been used to attack Newman's main group. Back on the Campbelltown, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The ship was a wreck, its upper decks a slaughterhouse. Commander Ryder, having successfully rammed the dock, turned his attention to the evacuation. He had ordered the remaining small motor launches to come alongside to take off the wounded and any commandos who had completed their tasks. But the launches were under constant attack. Many were already burning or sinking, their crews killed or wounded. The few that remained were swamped with desperate men, sailors and commandos alike, all trying to escape the floating inferno. Ryder, seeing that the mission to evacuate was becoming impossible, made a gut-wrenching decision. He ordered the remaining seaworthy launches to withdraw and head for the open sea, carrying as many men as they could. He, along with a small party of volunteers, would stay behind to help organize the defense of the perimeter and cover the withdrawal of the commandos on the dock. It was a decision that sealed his fate, but one that likely saved the lives of dozens of men who made it back to England on those few battered launches. The psychological toll on the men was immense. They were trapped in a nightmare of noise, smoke, and death. The constant, deafening roar of the guns, the screams of the wounded, the sight of comrades being blown apart, the smell of blood and burning flesh. These sensory assaults were relentless. The darkness, punctuated by the blinding glare of searchlights and the muzzle flashes of thousands of guns, created a surreal, dreamlike quality to the battle. Time lost all meaning. Men fought on instinct, their training taking over where conscious thought failed. Some felt a strange sense of detachment, as if they were watching a movie of themselves fighting. Others felt a surge of adrenaline-fueled fury, a cold rage that made them fearless. For most, it was simply a matter of survival, getting to the next piece of cover, firing the next shot, trying to stay alive for just one more minute. The ticking clock in the Campbelltown was a distant, almost forgotten concept, a secret hope buried under the immediate, overwhelming reality of the fight. As the first hours of daylight began to creep over the horizon, the true scale of the disaster for the British became apparent. The commandos on the dock were running low on ammunition and were being forced into smaller and smaller pockets of resistance. The German reinforcements, now fully alerted and mobilized, were pressing in from all sides. Newman, seeing that further offensive action was impossible and that his men were in danger of being annihilated, gathered his remaining officers. "The raid is over," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Our job is done. We've done what we came to do. Now we must try to get as many of our lads out as we can, but if we can't, we will surrender. I will not have them slaughtered uselessly." It was a soldier's decision, a pragmatic acceptance of a tactical defeat in the hope of a strategic victory. He gave the order for his men to try to break out in small groups and make for the countryside, hoping to find their way to a resistance network. For most, this hope was illusory. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and out of ammunition. One by one, the remaining pockets of resistance were silenced. The men who were not killed began to lay down their arms. The battle for St. Nazaire was, for all intents and purposes, over. The Germans had won. They had defeated the raiders, killed or captured nearly all of them, and secured their vital dock, or so they thought. They had forgotten about the silent, ticking heart of the Campbelltown, still buried deep within the wreckage, waiting for its moment to deliver the final, devastating blow. The silence and the thunder. The dawn of March 28, 1942, broke over St. Nazaire not with the gentle promise of a new day, but with the ugly, lingering aftermath of a brutal battle. The smoke from burning oil, shattered buildings, and the pyre of wrecked motor launches hung thick in the air, a greasy pall wall that muted the morning light and stung the eyes. The cacophony of the previous night, the roar of engine, the crash of artillery, the rattle of machine guns, the screams of men, had been replaced by an eerie, oppressive silence, broken only by the crackle of dying fires, the groans of the wounded, and the sharp, barked orders of German soldiers securing the area. The Normandy dock, the prize for which so much blood had been spilled, stood intact, a seemingly invincible monument to German engineering. Jammed into its entrance like a broken toy in the hands of a giant lay the shattered hulk of HMS Campbelltown. To the German soldiers and sailors who now swarmed over the dock, the scene was one of victory. They had repelled a daring, foolish, and ultimately suicidal British attack. The raid was over. They had won. For the captured British commandos and sailors, the morning brought a new kind of terror. The adrenaline that had sustained them through the night had drained away, leaving them exhausted, wounded, and facing the grim reality of their situation. They were herded together at gunpoint on the quayside, their hands on their heads, under the watchful eyes of triumphant and often vengeful German guards. The looks they received were a mixture of contempt, curiosity, and anger. These were not ordinary prisoners of war. They were commandos, the terror troops of Winston Churchill, men who had dared to strike deep within the heart of the Reich. The Germans had been caught off guard, humiliated by the audacity of the raid, and now they wanted retribution. The prisoners were forced to watch as the Germans began to assess the damage, a process that was marked by a growing sense of bewilderment. The British had attacked the most heavily defended port in Europe, suffered catastrophic losses, and achieved what? A few fires, some damaged machinery, and a wrecked destroyer blocking the dock entrance. It seemed a poor return for such a massive investment of lives. The captured men, their faces streaked with grime and blood, exchanged glances. They knew the truth. They knew about the clock, but they said nothing, their silence a final, defiant act of faith in their mission. The German commanders, led by the now awakened and furious Marinoburst Karl-Heinz Hoffmann, were not fools. They were experienced soldiers, and they knew that no military operation, especially one so daring, was undertaken without a clear objective. The fact that the British had rammed a destroyer into the dock, a seemingly pointless act of destruction, suggested that there was more to it than met the eye. A team of German naval engineers and ordnance experts was dispatched to examine the Campbelltown. They clambered over the twisted metal of the bow, their boots crunching on broken glass and debris. They noted the unusual weight of the ship, the way it sat low in the water despite the damage. They found the concrete ballast that had been used to disguise the ship's true purpose. And then they began to suspect. They started tapping on the bulkheads, sounding for hollow spaces. They used stethoscopes to listen for any telltale sign. The captured British officers, including Newman and Ryder, were interrogated, but they remained tight-lipped, offering only their name, rank, and serial number as required by the Geneva Convention. The Germans grew more frustrated. They knew there was a secret, but they couldn't find it. The morning wore on, and the Germans, convinced that the Campbelltown posed no further threat, turned their attention to the monumental task of clearing the wreck and assessing the damage to the dock. The caisson gate was bent and buckled, but it appeared to be structurally sound. The priority was to get the destroyer out of the way so that the dock could be returned to service as quickly as possible. Tugs were summoned, and thick steel hawsers were attached to the Campbelltown's stern. German soldiers, sailors, and even some French civilian dockworkers, curious about the night's extraordinary events, gathered on the quayside to watch the operation. The mood was one of relief and morbid curiosity. The danger was over. The British had been defeated. Now it was just a matter of cleaning up the mess. The captured British were forced to sit and watch, their hearts sinking as they saw the Germans preparing to move the ship. If they succeeded in pulling the Campbelltown away before the explosives detonated, the entire raid would have been for nothing. The sacrifice of their comrades would be rendered meaningless. The silence on the dock was now filled with a new, agonizing tension. The German engineers, however, were still uneasy. The ship's construction seemed odd. The false bulkheads they had found were not just for disguise. They were there to hide something significant. They continued their search with renewed vigor. One young officer, a keen-eyed lieutenant, noticed that the forwardmost compartment of the ship, the area that had taken the brunt of the impact, was sealed off by an unusually thick wall of steel. He ordered his men to cut through it. Using acetylene torches, they began to slice into the hull, the bright blue-white flame casting dancing shadows on the soot-stained metal. The captured British watched this activity with a mixture of hope and dread. If the Germans found the explosives, they might be able to defuse them. But if the torches ignited the amytal, the bomb could go off prematurely, killing everyone on the dock, including the prisoners. The air crackled with a new kind of danger. The Germans, oblivious to the true nature of their peril, worked with methodical efficiency, their curiosity overriding their caution. They were so close to uncovering the secret that lay at the heart of the mission. Meanwhile, in a temporary headquarters set up in a nearby building, The German High Command was receiving reports. Hoffmann was on the phone to his superiors in Paris and Berlin, explaining the situation. He described the raid as a failure, a costly tactical blunder by the British. He reported that the port was secure, the attackers killed or captured, and the damage to the dock minimal. He recommended that the standard garrison be retained as the threat had passed. The news was met with relief in Berlin. The Tirpitz, currently holed up in a Norwegian fjord, was safe. The threat of it being able to use the Atlantic base at St. Nazaire for repairs was, for the moment, neutralized by the British attack itself. But the Germans believed the facility would be operational again soon. The German propaganda machine began to prepare its version of events, a heroic defense of the fatherland against a gang of British terrorists and pirates. The narrative of victory was being writ, even as the instrument of that victory's destruction lay silently in the dock, its hidden clock ticking away the final minutes. For the captured commandos, the waiting was a form of psychological torture. They were exhausted, hungry, and in pain from their wounds. They were surrounded by the enemy, their fate uncertain. But their greatest fear was not for themselves, but for the mission. They had risked everything, and now it seemed it was all going to be for nothing. They thought of their friends who had died on the quays, on the decks of the launches, in the burning warehouses. Had they died in vain? The question hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. Lieutenant Colonel Newman, his face a mask of stoic calm, tried to keep his men's spirits up. He moved among them as best he could, offering a word of encouragement, a steadying hand on a shoulder. He knew the truth. He knew about the clock, and he knew that the mission was not yet over. He just had to hope that the clock was still ticking. The German engineers finally cut through the steel bulkhead. Peering inside with flashlights, they saw not a mass of tangled wires and complex timers, but something far more simple and terrifying. Packed in the very bow of the ship, in a space the size of a small room, were dozens of waterproof canvas bags, each filled with a waxy, pinkish substance, amytal, a massive, primitive, and utterly devastating bomb. A sudden, chilling silence fell over the German work party. They stared at the deadly cargo, their faces pale in the flashlight beams. One of them dropped his tool, the clatter echoing loudly in the confined space. They had found the secret, and in that moment they understood the true nature of the raid. It wasn't just an attack, it was a trap, a massive, time-delayed booby trap left in the heart of their most valuable asset. A frantic alarm was raised. Bomb, bomb, rouse hirer, schnell. The shout went up across the dock. The tugs were ordered to cast off their lines. The soldiers and civilians on the quayside were told to move back, to get away from the ship. The captured British were herded further away, their guards now looking at them not with contempt, but with a new, dawning respect and fear. The silence on the dock was shattered, replaced by a frantic, panicked scramble for safety. The victory had turned into a nightmare. The only question now was how much time they had. The hammer falls. The frantic German alarm, a guttural shout of bomb, transformed the dock at St. Nazaire from a scene of mopping up victory into a panorama of panicked flight. The discovery of the amytal in the Campbelltown's bow was a psychological sledgehammer. The certainty of triumph, the relief of having repelled the attackers, curdled instantly into a cold, primal fear. The order to evacuate the area was met with a chaotic scramble. German soldiers, who moments before had been swaggering with victory, now sprinted for cover, their discipline forgotten in the face of an unseen, ticking doom. The French dockworkers, caught between the occupiers' orders and their own terror, scattered in all directions, seeking shelter behind massive cranes, in the doorways of thick-walled warehouses, or simply throwing themselves flat on the concrete. The captured British commandos were roughly shoved and pushed away from the dock's edge, their guards' faces now etched with a fear that mirrored their own. For the British, this sudden reversal was a moment of profound, almost surreal vindication. They saw the panic on their captors' faces and knew the clock was still ticking. Their sacrifice had not been in vain. The German officers, trying to regain control of the situation, faced an impossible choice. The bomb was enormous, far too large to be moved. The idea of defusing it was dismissed almost immediately. The charge was too massive, the damage from the impact too severe, and the expertise required simply not available on site. The only option was to clear the area and wait. But wait for how long? The British had been notoriously clever. The timer could be set for hours, or it could be set for minutes. The uncertainty was a torturous weapon. Hoffmann, his face ashen, ordered his men to fall back to a perimeter of at least 500 meters from the dock. He established a new command post in a reinforced concrete building, praying it would be far enough away. The dock, the center of the German world in St. Nazaire just minutes before, was now a ghost town, abandoned to the silent, deadly ship embedded in its gates. The only sounds were the crackle of the last dying fires and the distant, panicked shouts of men trying to get to safety. The tension was a physical presence, a weight in the air that made it hard to breathe. For the captured commandos, herded into a large, open warehouse a safe distance from the dock, the weight was an exercise in emotional whiplash. They were prisoners, defeated, their future uncertain and likely grim. Yet they were also the only ones on that French coast who truly understood what was about to happen. They exchanged knowing glances, small, almost imperceptible nods that spoke volumes. They were no longer just captives. They were witnesses to the culmination of their own mission. They could see the German soldiers guarding them, their young faces pale and strained, their eyes darting nervously toward the silent, smoking destroyer in the distance. The British felt a grim satisfaction. These were the men who had been shooting at them, killing their friends just hours before. Now they were waiting to be blown to pieces by the very weapon the British had delivered. The irony was a bitter, yet strangely comforting taste. The ticking clock, hidden in the Campbelltown, was no longer just a mechanism. It was an instrument of poetic justice. The Germans, in their frantic search, had not found the timing device itself. It was hidden deep within the mass of explosives, protected by layers of steel and concrete. It was a simple, robust chemical delay fuse, designed to be reliable and unstoppable. It had been set for approximately 8 hours before the Campbelltown had rammed the dock. The impact, the fire, the chaos of the battle, none of it had disturbed it. It had continued its silent, relentless work, its progress marked by the slow, inexorable change in a chemical compound. While the Germans had been celebrating their victory, interrogating prisoners and preparing to clear the wreck, the fuse had been burning down. While the engineers had been cutting through the bulkhead, the fuse had been nearing its end. And now, as the Germans scrambled for safety, the final, irreversible chemical reaction was taking place. The clock had run its course. The hammer was poised to fall. At 10:35 hours on March 28, 1942, just over 9 hours after HMS Campbelltown had slammed into the Normandy dock, the silence was shattered. It was not a sharp, crackling explosion, but a deep, earth-shattering boom. It was a sound that seemed to come from the very center of the earth, a pressure wave that hit the chest like a physical blow. The ground trembled violently, and a mushroom cloud of smoke, flame, and debris rose thousands of feet into the air, visible for miles around. The massive caisson gate of the Normandy dock, a structure designed to withstand the pressure of millions of tons of water, simply ceased to exist. It was vaporized, blown into a million fragments of steel and concrete that were hurled outward like shrapnel. The water in the dock basin, displaced by the force of the blast, surged over the sides in a mini tsunami, sweeping away everything in its path. The scene in the moments after the explosion was one of utter devastation. The Campbelltown itself was gone, its stern section, which had been relatively intact, now twisted and broken, thrown clear of the dock like a discarded toy. The area where the ship had been was now a crater, a gaping wound in the concrete. The pumping house and winding house, so painstakingly destroyed by Roy Hodges' team, were further obliterated by the blast. The German soldiers who had been too slow in their retreat were caught by the explosion and the tidal wave. The sound of the blast was followed by a horrifying silence, and then by the screams of the wounded and the dying. The air was filled with a thick gray dust that made it impossible to see, and the smell of burning chemicals and pulverized concrete was overwhelming. The German command post, though it had survived, was shaken to its foundation, its windows blown in. Hoffman and his staff stumbled out, dazed and covered in dust, to witness the total destruction of their prize asset. The victory they had claimed just hours before was now a smoking ruin. The raiders from beyond the grave had delivered their final, devastating message. In the warehouse where the British prisoners were being held, the effect was different. The explosion was a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph. The massive boom shook the building, rattling the windows and sending a cloud of dust down from the rafters. But the British prisoners did not cower. They rose to their feet as one, a spontaneous, defiant cheer erupting from their throats. They cheered for their fallen comrades, for the success of their mission, for the sheer, audacious brilliance of it all. They cheered until they were hoarse, their faces alight with a fierce joy that transcended their captivity. Their German guards, stunned and demoralized by the blast, could only stare at them in disbelief. These men, defeated and captured, were celebrating. It was a display of spirit that the Germans could not comprehend. For the commandos, the sound of the explosion was the sweetest music they had ever heard. It was the sound of success, the sound of vindication, the sound that told them their sacrifice had mattered. The ticking clock had spoken, and its words were final. The news of the explosion at St. Nazaire traveled fast. In London, at the Admiralty, the mood had been one of grim apprehension. The last radio contact from the raiding force had been hours ago, and it was clear that the mission had suffered heavy losses. The first reports from German radio, crowing about the defeat of a British raid, had been disheartening. But then, a different kind of report came in. A French resistance agent, using a clandestine radio, transmitted a short coded message. "The dock is gone." A very loud bang. Soon after, German radio broadcasts fell silent, and then resumed with a very different, more somber tone. In the Prime Minister's office, Winston Churchill Churchill, who had personally authorized the raid, received the news with a mixture of relief and sorrow. He knew the cost in human life had been terrible, but he also understood the strategic importance of the success. He later wrote in his memoirs that the Saint-Nazaire raid was a feat of arms which, in its daring and in its success, has few parallels in the annals of war. The ticking clock had not just destroyed a dock, it had delivered a powerful blow to enemy morale and a significant boost to British spirits at a critical point in the war. The immediate aftermath of the blast was a scene of horror and chaos. German rescue teams, composed of soldiers and sailors, worked frantically to pull survivors from the rubble and the water. The casualties were horrific. Hundreds of German military personnel and French civilians had been killed or wounded in the explosion, many of them simply curious onlookers who had gathered to watch the operation to clear the wreck. The destruction was total. The Normandy dock was not just damaged, it was rendered completely useless. The roof of the dry dock had collapsed in on itself, and the basin was filled with a tangled mess of concrete, steel, and the remains of the Campbelltown. It was clear to even the most optimistic engineer that this was not a repair that could be completed in weeks or months. It would take years. The strategic objective of the raid, the reason for the sacrifice, had been achieved with terrifying finality. The Tirpitz and any other German heavy warship was now effectively trapped in the North Sea, a sitting duck for the Royal Air Force, unable to risk a voyage into the Atlantic without a safe haven for repairs. The ghost ship's gambit had succeeded beyond all expectation. The price of 1,000 words. The dust had settled over Saint-Nazaire, but the reverberations of the explosion on March 28, 1942, were felt far beyond the shattered ruins of the Normandy dock. In Berlin, the news was received with fury and disbelief. The German High Command, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht (OKW), had been caught napping, humiliated by a force they considered inferior. The carefully constructed narrative of an impregnable Atlantic wall had been proven a lie. Adolf Hitler, upon receiving the full report, was apoplectic with rage. He saw the raid not just as a military setback, but as a profound insult to German prestige and a personal affront. The audacity of the British, the sheer cheek of sending a suicide mission into the heart of a heavily defended fortress, was something he could not comprehend or tolerate. His reaction would be swift, brutal, and would define the fate of the captured commandos. The success of the raid had been bought with blood, and the price was about to be paid in full. On October 18, 1942, 7 months after the raid, Hitler issued the infamous Kommandobefehl, or Commando Order. It was a direct response to the Saint-Nazaire raid and other similar commando operations. The order was chillingly explicit. From now on, all men operating against German troops in so-called commando raids in Europe and in Africa are to be annihilated to the last man. Even if these individuals on discovery make themselves known as prisoners of war, no pardon is on any account to be given. The order was a clear violation of the Geneva Convention, which guaranteed the rights of prisoners of war. It was an order for murder, sanctioned at the highest level. The men of the Saint-Nazaire raid, who had already endured so much, were now marked for death. Their status as soldiers, as prisoners of war, was stripped away. In the eyes of the Nazi regime, they were terrorists, bandits to be annihilated. The ticking clock in the Campbelltown had delivered a strategic victory, but it had also unleashed a new, more insidious form of terror upon the men who had set it. The 5 commando officers who had been captured at Saint-Nazaire, Lieutenant Colonel Augustus Newman, Captain Roy Hodges, Captain William Pritchard, Captain Gary Everett, and Lieutenant William Woodcock, were held in a special camp for POWs, Offlog IVC at Colditz Castle, a fortress supposedly escape-proof. They were isolated from the other prisoners, their fate a subject of constant speculation. Then, in late 1942, they were informed that they were to be transferred to a camp in Poland. Instead, they were taken to a civilian prison in Berlin, where they were subjected to a sham trial. The charges were spurious, illegally using enemy uniforms and sabotage. The outcome was never in doubt. They were found guilty and sentenced to death. The news of their sentence and of Hitler's commando order sent shockwaves through the British government. Intense diplomatic pressure was brought to bear, and the sentences were commuted to life imprisonment. The officers were sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, a place of unimaginable brutality. They were held in a special compound known as the Hungerbunker, under conditions designed to break them. They were starved, beaten, and subjected to psychological torture. Yet they endured. Their survival became a quiet, defiant act of resistance against the tyranny that sought to destroy them. The fate of the other captured commandos and sailors was even more tragic. They were not held as POWs, but were dispersed among various civilian prisons and concentration camps, including Sachsenhausen, Flossenburg, and Natzweiler. They were not registered as prisoners of war, effectively disappearing into the Nazi camp system. They were forced to perform hard labor, starve, and subjected to the same same brutality as the other inmates. Of the 169 British prisoners taken at Saint-Nazaire, only 102 would survive the war. The other 67 died from starvation, disease, brutal treatment, or were murdered in cold blood. Some were shot by the Gestapo in reprisal for other acts of resistance. Others simply wasted away, their names and numbers lost in the chaos of the collapsing Third Reich. The sacrifice they had made on the docks of Saint-Nazaire was followed by a longer, more agonizing sacrifice in the camps. They had paid the ultimate price for their courage, not just once, but over and over again, day after day, until the end. The strategic impact of the raid, however, was undeniable and lasting. The destruction of the Normandy dock was a masterstroke of strategic planning. The dock was the only one of its size on the French Atlantic coast capable of servicing Germany's largest warships, most notably the 42,000-ton battleship Tirpitz. With the dock at Saint-Nazaire out of commission, the Tirpitz was effectively trapped in the fjords of Norway. It could not risk venturing into the Atlantic to attack Allied convoys, as any significant damage would require a perilous journey back to Germany for repairs, a journey it could not hope to make with the Royal Navy and RAF hunting. The Tirpitz became a fleet in being, a threat that tied up enormous Allied naval resources, but was itself too vulnerable to act. The RAF mounted a series of costly air raids against the battleship in its Norwegian lair, finally sinking it in November 1944. But the first, and arguably most decisive, blow against the Tirpitz's operational freedom had been struck not by a 1,000-bomber raid, but by a single, obsolete destroyer packed with explosives and a few hundred incredibly brave men. The ticking clock had altered the course of the naval war in the Atlantic. In Britain, the story of the Saint-Nazaire raid was a beacon of hope in a dark period of the war. 1942 was a year of setbacks, the fall of Singapore, the disaster at Dieppe, and the U-boat offensive taking a heavy toll on Allied shipping. The Saint-Nazaire raid was a victory that could be celebrated, a story of courage against impossible odds that captured the public imagination. The survivors who had escaped on the small motor launches were feted as heroes. Their stories were told in newspapers, on the radio, and in newsreels. The raid was a powerful propaganda tool, demonstrating that Britain could and would strike back at the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. It was a testament to the fighting spirit of the nation and a vindication of Churchill's policy of supporting special forces operations. The Victoria Cross, Britain's highest award for valor, was awarded to 5 participants: Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beattie, who had taken command of the Campbelltown after Ryder was wounded; Lieutenant Colonel Augustus Newman; Sergeant Thomas Duran, who fought a heroic action on one of the motor launches before being killed; Commander Robert Ryder; and able seaman William Savage, who manned an exposed machine gun position on the Campbelltown. A total of 89 other decorations were awarded to the survivors, making it one of most highly decorated actions of the Second World War. The nation recognized the extraordinary courage of the men who had undertaken what was, in essence, a suicide mission. The legacy of the Saint-Nazaire raid is complex and enduring. It stands as a monument to human courage and ingenuity in the face of overwhelming odds. It was a victory born not of superior numbers or firepower, but of audacity, meticulous planning, and a willingness to sacrifice everything for a strategic goal. The raid demonstrated the power of asymmetric warfare, a lesson that has been learned and relearned in conflicts ever since. It showed that a small, highly motivated force, armed with a clever plan and immense courage, could inflict damage out of all proportion to its size. But the legacy is also a somber one. It is a reminder of the terrible cost of war, of the fine line between military necessity and atrocity. The story of the captured commandos, subjected to illegal and brutal treatment, is a stark counterpoint to the heroism of the raid itself. It forces a confrontation with the brutal realities of war against a totalitarian enemy that recognized no rules. The raid at Saint-Nazaire was not just a military operation. It was a human drama of sacrifice, survival, and the enduring power of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable darkness. The echo of the ticking clock in the Campbelltown's bow has faded, but its story, and the story of the men who carried it, continues to resonate. Section Conclusion Epilogue. The echo of a single tick. The Normandy dock at Saint-Nazaire was never rebuilt to its former glory. After the war, the shattered caisson and the collapsed roof of the dry dock stood as a rusting, concrete tomb, a silent monument to the night of March 28, 1942. It is a place of pilgrimage now, for historians, for veterans' families, for those who seek to understand the extremes of human courage. To stand there is to feel the weight of history, to imagine the roar of the engine, the crash of the guns, and the final, earth-shattering boom that sealed the raid's success. The men who carried out this mission are gone now, their stories passed down through books, films, and the quiet quiet remembrance of their comrades. Yet the echo of their sacrifice remains. It is found not in the grand strategic analyses of the war, but in the simple, profound question their story forces us to ask. What is the value of a single, selfless act against a tide of overwhelming darkness? The raid on Saint-Nazaire was a tactical madness that achieved a strategic masterpiece, a paradox that speaks to the heart of conflict. It reminds us that history is not shaped by impersonal forces alone, but by the choices of individuals, by those who dare to do the impossible, and by the silent, relentless ticking of a clock set in motion by hope and defiance. The end story. The German garrison at Saint-Nazaire, commanded by the competent and cautious Captain Zur C. Karl-Heinz Hoffmann, was a formidable force. The port was a cornerstone of the Atlantic Wall, and its defense was a matter of utmost priority. The Normandy dock, a marvel of engineering capable of holding the largest warships in the world, was protected by overlapping fields of fire from 88 anti-aircraft guns that could be depressed to fire at sea-level targets, 20 and 37 anti-aircraft cannons, and dozens of heavy machine gun nests. The approaches to the dock were covered by searchlights that could turn night into day, and the harbor entrance was blocked by a massive anti-submarine net. The garrison itself numbered over 5,000 men, a mix of Kriegsmarine sailors, Heer infantry, and Luftwaffe anti-aircraft crews. They were well-fed, well-equipped, and confident in their impregnability. Their intelligence suggested that any British attack would come from the air, a bombing raid that they were well prepared to repel. The idea of a surface attack was, in their estimation, the height of folly, a suicide mission that no professional military would attempt. This confidence, this professional arrogance, was the chink in their armor that the British intended to exploit with ruthless precision. Aboard the Campbelltown, the minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Lieutenant Colonel Augustus Charles Newman, commanding the commando contingent, moved among his men. His presence was a steadying force, a rock of calm in a sea of mounting anxiety. He didn't offer false hope or stirring speeches. His quiet confidence was message enough. These were not raw recruits. They were volunteers, men who had passed the grueling selection process for the Special Service Brigade, the forerunners of the modern commandos. They were a mix of hardened veterans from the early campaigns of France and Norway, and eager young men drawn by the promise of action and the chance to strike back at the enemy. They were armed with a variety of weapons: the reliable Lee Enfield rifle, the Sten submachine gun with its distinctive high rate of fire, grenades, and Bangalore torpedoes for breaching wire and obstacles. Each man carried over 60 pounds of equipment, a burden that would test their endurance in the hours to come. The air in the cramped mess decks was thick with the smell of sweat, oil, and the acrid tang of cordite from the weapons being checked for the final time. The low murmur of voices, the clink of metal, the shuffling of feet, these were the sounds of men preparing to walk into the mouth of hell. At 21:30 hours, the flotilla reached a pre-arranged position approximately 8 miles from the mouth of the Loire. Here, the final preparations were made. The German flag on the Campbelltown was run up, its swastika stark against the darkening sky. The ship's company assumed their roles for the deception. Signalman William Alfred Spike Saunders, a man known for his cool nerve and impeccable German, took his position at the signal lamp, ready to flash responses to any German challenges. The ship's silhouette, altered by cutting down the funnels and masts and adding a new, more Germanic-looking bridge structure, was inspected one last time. The plan was to sail past the outer defenses, responding to signals with the correct German codes, bluffing their way through until the last possible moment. The 16 motor launches, carrying the rest of the commandos and the teams assigned to destroy the pumping machinery and winding houses, fanned out behind the Campbelltown, their engines muffled, their dark hulls low in the water, waiting for the signal to follow their mother ship into the jaws of death. The men aboard these small vessels felt particularly vulnerable, exposed on the open water, knowing that a single hit from a German gun could send them to the bottom in seconds. The German lookouts at the Point de St. Gildas, on the northern bank of the estuary, were the first to spot the approaching flotilla. Through their binoculars, they saw a ship of the Meaux class heading directly for the harbor entrance. It was an unusual sight, but not an alarming one. German ships frequently entered and left Saint-Nazaire. The lookout reported the sighting, but no alarm was raised. The ship was behaving correctly, maintaining a steady course and speed. On the bridge of the Campbelltown, Commander Ryder and his officers watched the German shore through their own binoculars, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Every second that passed without challenge was a small victory, another step closer to their target. The ship was now within range of the German coastal artillery, a fact that was not lost on the men on deck. They could see the dark shapes of the gun emplacements on the cliffs above, silent and menacing. The ticking clock in the ship's bow seemed to grow louder in their minds, a constant reminder of the deadly cargo they carried. The air was electric electric, charged with the potential for sudden, explosive violence. At 22:12 hours, the illusion shattered. A German signal station on the south bank of the estuary near the village of St. Mark flashed a challenge. "State your identity and destination." Signalman Saunders, his hand steady, responded with the pre-arranged German signal claiming to be the torpedo boat Jaguar returning from patrol. The Germans seemed satisfied. For a few more precious minutes the deception held, but then a second, more urgent signal was flashed. "Heave to and be boarded." The Germans were becoming suspicious. Ryder knew the game was up. He couldn't stop. To stop was to fail. He gave the order. "Full ahead, make for the dock." The engines roared, and the Campbelltown surged forward, its disguise now irrelevant. Simultaneously, the British lowered the German flag and hoisted the white ensign of the Royal Navy. It was an act of supreme defiance, a declaration of war in the heart of enemy territory. The moment the flag changed, the German searchlights snapped on, blinding beams of white light crisscrossing the water, illuminating the Campbelltown and the small launches trailing behind her. The night, which had been their ally, was now their enemy. The effect was instantaneous. The German gunners, no longer deceived, sprang into action. The first shells screamed overhead, impacting harmlessly in the water, but the sound was terrifying. A high-pitched whistle followed by a deafening crash and a towering plume of spray. Then, the machine guns opened up. The air was filled with the sound of ripping canvas as tracers stitched their way across the water toward the British ships. On the Campbelltown's bridge, a storm of shrapnel and bullets erupted. A young officer standing next to Ryder was hit in the throat, collapsing without a sound. The deck plates vibrated with the impact of near misses. The men on deck scrambled for cover, some diving behind the ship's superstructure, others flattening themselves on the steel deck. The smell of cordite and burning metal filled the air, mixed with the ozone scent of the searchlights. The noise was overwhelming, a physical assault on the eardrums. The roar of the engines, the crash of the guns, the rattle of machine guns, and the screams of the first wounded men. The mission had entered its most violent phase. The Campbelltown, a 1,090-ton target, was now a magnet for every German gun within range. The ship's 12-pounder gun on the forecastle returned fire, its crew working with desperate speed, but it was hopelessly outmatched by the German shore batteries. The small motor launches, which had been ordered to follow the Campbelltown in, were suffering terribly. Their wooden hulls offered no protection against the storm of steel. ML-192 was hit almost immediately, a direct hit from an 88 Michel tearing it apart, killing all aboard. Other launches were raked by machine gun fire, their engines disabled, their decks slick with blood. The carefully planned assault was dissolving into chaos, yet the Campbelltown drove on. Commander Ryder, wounded in the arm but still on his feet, urged his helmsman forward. "Ram the dock," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the din. The ship, its hull already pockmarked with holes, was heading straight for the massive caisson gate of the Normandy dock at a speed of nearly 20 knots. The men below decks, the commandos waiting to disembark, braced themselves for the impact. They could hear the hellish noise above, feel the shuddering of the ship with each hit, and smell the smoke and blood. They were trapped in a steel coffin hurtling toward a concrete wall, and the only way out was through the enemy. The final approach was a nightmare of fire and steel. The German searchlights held the Campbelltown in a brilliant, unforgiving glare, making it a perfect target. The ship's wheelhouse was destroyed, the helmsman killed. Ryder himself took over, steering the ship from an exposed position on the bridge wing, a target for every German sniper. The ship was hit again and again, but the old American-built destroyer, designed for the rigors of North Atlantic convoy duty, was a tough old bird. It absorbed the punishment, its engines somehow still turning, its propellers still biting into the water. The commandos on the mess deck, packed together like sardines, felt each concussive blast through the soles of their feet. They could hear the shouts of the wounded, the screams of the dying, and the ever-present, terrifying whistle of incoming shells. Some men began to sing, a low, ragged chorus of "Roll Out the Barrel," a bizarre, almost hysterical counterpoint to the symphony of destruction around them. It was a display of the peculiarly British brand of courage in the face of despair, defiant, ironic, and utterly human. The ticking clock in the bow, buried under tons of concrete and steel, was now counting down its final hours, its silent, deadly purpose unknown to the Germans who were trying so desperately to sink it.